Good day, future CPA. We are from Bachelor of Science in Accountancy, second year. We're here to discuss and explain all about bonds payable. I'm your Mark Christopher Magbanwa with Kylie Kamantige.
Let's go on to discuss bonds payable. First, let's tackle about learning objectives. State the initial and subsequent measurements of bonds payable. Account for compound financial instruments. Explain the accounting for the recognition of liabilities. State the requirements for the offsetting of financial assets and financial liabilities. Let's tackle now the definition of bonds payable. Next. Bonds payable is a long-term debt instrument similar to notes and loans, except that bonds are usually offered to the public and sold to many investors. For bonds payable, issuer is the debtor. Bondholders or investors are the creditor. Bonds is issued between a corporation and a company because it is made under a seal. Next. Debt instruments. Contract that represents a right upon the holder to receive cash from the issuer. Ito yung kontrata na nagpapatunay na may obligation si issuer na magbayad kay holder. Example nito is sa promissory notes. Next. Bond indenture. It is a contractual agreement between the issuer and the holder. Under bond indenture, we have the rights and duties of bondholders and issuer, a call provision, a redemption rights, and B, the restriction and requirements of the issuer, the sinking fund, financial ratios, restriction on dividends available to the issuer shareholders, restriction on incurrence of additional obligations, appointment of independent trustee, authorized amount, and lastly, the interest rate, payment dates, and maturity dates. Next. Next is the bond certificate. It is a certification issued to the bondholders with the amount of bonds he has purchased. Next. Next is the issuance of bonds. Bonds can be issued in several ways. Through underwriting, auction, or direct placement with investors. Next is the type of bonds. Next slide. Type of bonds as to maturity. Term bonds, bonds that mature on a single date. Serial bonds, bonds in which the principal matures in installments. Extendable and retractable bonds. Extendable bonds, bonds that give the holders the right to extend the initial maturity, while the retractable bonds naman give the holders the right to shorten the initial maturity to an earlier date. As to recording point of view and payment of interest. Registered bonds, bonds issued in the name of the holder, interests are paid directly to the holder. Coupon bearer bonds, bonds that can be freely transferred and have a detachable coupon for each interest payment. Zero coupon bonds, or strip bonds or deep discount bonds, bonds that do not pay periodic interest. Income bonds, bonds that pay interest only if the issuer earns profit. Participating bonds, bonds that participate in excess earnings of the issuer as defined in the indenture. Index bonds, bonds that pay interest that is indexed to a measure of general purchasing power, such as the Consumer Price Index. Inflation-linked bonds, bonds whose principal and interest payments are adjusted in response to inflation. As to security and risk. Mortgage bonds, bonds secured by a real property. Collateral trust bonds, bonds secured by the issuer securities. Asset-backed bonds, bonds collateralized by a pool of assets, such as credit card, receivables, and car loans. Subordinated bonds, bonds that have a higher yield than a secure bonds but a lower priority during liquidation. Debenture bonds, bonds that are secured by any collateral. Junk bonds, high risk, high yield bonds typically issued to finance leverage buyouts and mergers. As to right of redemption. Callable bonds, bonds that the issuer can redeem prior to maturity date. Convertible bonds, but bonds that the holder can exchange for the issuer's shares of stocks. Corporate bonds, bonds issued by a corporation. Government bonds, bonds issued by a government. As to currency. International bonds, bonds issued by a foreign entity in a domestic market. Under international bonds, there is a euro bonds, bonds denominated in a currency other than the currency of the market in which they are offered. B is a foreign bonds, bonds denominated in a currency of the domestic market in which they are offered. And there is an example of foreign bonds. First is the kangaroo bonds or Matilda bonds, Australian dollar denominated bonds. Second is maple bonds, Canadian dollar denominated bonds. Third is the matador bonds, euro denominated bonds issued in Spain. Bulldog bonds, British pound denominated bonds. And lastly is the Yankee bonds, issued dollar denominated bonds issued in the US market. C is the global bonds, bonds that are issued in several countries at the same time. Next.
For accounting for bonds has three subcategories such as bond premium and discount. Kasama dito yung unamortized balance of discounts, and then accounting for transaction costs or bond issue costs, and lastly, issuance of bonds between interest payment dates. So bonds. Bonds are accounted for in much the same way as the notes payable and loans payable. Bonds are normally long-term, bear interest, issued at a premium or discount, and entail transaction cost or issue cost. So ang mga bonds ay loans o perang ipinahiram mo sa mga kumpanya o tinatawag na corporate bonds, pwede rin sa mga gobyerno o tinatawag na mga treasury bonds, at marami pang iba. Nagpapahiram ka ng pera sa isang kumpanya o sa gobyerno at ibabalik nila ang pera mo na may karagdagang interes sa maturity date nito. So una, bond premium and discount. For discount, cash proceeds or carrying amount is less than face amount. Effective interest rate is higher than nominal interest rate. Interest expense is greater than interest paid. And for premium, cash proceeds or carrying amount is greater than face amount. Effective interest rate is lower than nominal interest rate. Interest expense is less than interest paid. So note, there is no premium or discount if bonds are issued at face amount, except when transaction costs are incurred. So kasama siya sa itong unamortized balance naman, the unamortized balance of discounts or premium as at a certain date is the difference between the face amount and the carrying amount of the bonds at that date. Ibig sabihin lang, yung face amount, ibabawas lang natin sa carrying amount of that bonds. So, accounting for transaction cost. So, may ano lang siya, fair value less transaction cost. So, except dun sa mga FVPL natin, tapos makukuha natin yung financial liabilities. So accordingly, transaction costs on issuing bonds are deducted when determining the carrying amount of the bonds. Subsequently, the transaction costs are amortized using the effective interest method. Transaction costs may require an adjustment to the effective interest rate. So sa trial and error, may gagamitin tayong formula which is yung future cash flows times PV factor at X% equals present value. Sa future cash flows, nakapaloob dito yung mga principal tsaka interest lang para dun sa mga future cash flows natin. Sa PV factor, gagamit tayo ng gagamit tayo ng PV of 1 peso kung due only at maturity date. Gagamit naman tayo ng PV of ordinary annuity of 1 peso kapag naman due annually. So, ayun lang present value natin. Kung hindi naman kasama yung bond issue cost, the amortization shall be allocated to the bond issue cost and the discount based on their outstanding balance as shown below. So for simplicity, we will follow the previous accounting treatment of adding the bond issue cost with the bond discount or deducting the bond issue cost from the bond premium. Sa issuance of bonds between interest payments, when bonds are issued between interest payments dates, The accrued interest prior to the issuance date is excluded in the initial measurement of the bonds and credited to the interest payable or interest expense. The interest expense recognized represents only the interest incurred after the issuance date.
Issue price of bonds. The issue price of bonds can be estimated by discounting the future cash flows of the bonds at a specified effective interest rate. Next. Bond refunding. Bond refunding, the issuance of a new bonds and using the proceeds to retire an outstanding bond issue. The new bonds usually have lower interest than the replaced bonds. New bonds is recorded in the regular manner while the old bond is extinguished or retired. Retirements of bonds prior to maturity. When bonds are retired, any difference between the retirement price and the carrying amount is recognized as gain or loss in a profit or loss. Next. Serial bonds. Bonds that mature in installments. Installment payments consist of payments for both interest and principal. Next.
For zero coupon bonds are bonds that do not pay periodic interest, and both the principal and compounded interest are due only at maturity date. So, ang ibig sabihin lang, hindi ka magbabayad ng interest periodically ang mangyayari sa maturity date mo lang babayaran yung principal at interest. So, callable bonds are bonds that the issuer can redeem prior to maturity date. When measuring callable bonds at amortized cost, the issuer should estimate its expected holding period, which may be shorter than the original maturity date, and amortize any discount or premium over that period. Subsequent changes are treated as changes in accounting estimates and are accounted for prospectively. So callable bonds, also known as a redeemable bond, is a bond that the issuer may redeem before it reaches the stated maturity date. It is also allowing the issuing company to pay off their debt early. A company may choose to call their bond if market interest rates move lower, which will allow them to reborrow at more beneficial rate. Simple lang, ang callable bonds ay rights ni issuer para i-force yung holder na magbayad ng debt bago ang maturity date nito.
Putable instrument. The holder has the right to return to the issuer in exchange for cash or another financial asset, or is automatically put back to the issuer upon the occurrence of a specific future event. Example is the death of the holder. Includes a contractual obligation of the issuer to redeem or repurchases the instrument. Classified as financial liabilities except when the instruments also represent a residual interest in the net assets of the issuing entity classified as an equity instrument. So yung putable instrument lang, ito lang yung right ng holder na ibalik yung bonds in exchange sa cash or another financial asset. Pero may chance na automatic siyang mababalik sa issuer pag namatay yung holder. Or example, namatay yung holder. Next.
Compound financial instruments is a financial instrument that, from the issuer's perspective, contains both a liability and an equity component. These components are classified and accounted for separately. An example of compound instrument is convertible bonds. So convertible bonds are bonds that can be converted into shares of stocks of the issuer. When an entity issues convertible bonds, in effect, it is issuing two instruments. Number one, a debt instrument for the bonds payable, and number two, an equity instrument for the equity conversion feature. These two components are presented separately in the statement of financial position. Tapos, meron tayong equity. So, ang equity is defined as a residual amount. Ang ginagawa lang naman dito is yung parang sa basic accounting natin na asset minus liabilities equals equity. Pero dito kasi, ang gagawin is cash proceed from issuance of compound instrument less the fair value of debt component without the equity feature. Equals na nun yung equity component. Bonds with share warrants. To improve saleability, bonds are sometimes issued with share amounts. A share warrants entitles the holder to purchase shares of stocks of issuer at a fixed price. Then generally, the life of the warrant is 5 years, occasionally 10 years, and very occasionally, an entity may offer perpetual warrants. Share warrants attached to bonds may be detachable or non-detachable. A detachable share warrants can be detached or separated from the bond and traded as a separate security. A non-detachable warrant cannot be sold separately from the bond. Bond issued with share warrants, whether detachable or not, are compound financial instrument and are accounted for similar to convertible bonds. However, unlike convertible bonds, the exercise of share warrants does not extinguish the bonds. So, sa reclassification, ang PFRS 9 po, pinoprohibits niya ang reclassification of financial liabilities. So, the recognition of financial liabilities. A liability is extinguished in many ways. For example, through repayment in cash, transfer of non-cash asset or rendering of services, issuance of equity securities, replacement of existing obligation with a new obligation, waiver or cancellation by the creditor, and expiration. So, ang the recognition po is the removal, ang pag-aalis po ng mga previously recognized asset natin at mga liability from the entity's statement of financial position.
Transfer of non-cash assets or asset swap. When a debtor settles an obligation by transferring non-cash assets to the creditor, the difference between the carrying amount of the liability extinguished and the carrying amount of the non-cash asset transferred is recognized as gain or loss in profit or loss. So yung transfer of non-cash asset lang is gumamit ng instead of cash, gumamit ng ibang asset yung debtor para ma-settle yung obligation niya. Next. Transfer of equity securities or equity swap. When the terms of financial liability are renegotiated such that the debtor settles it by issuing equity securities to the creditor, the difference between the carrying amount of the liability extinguished and the fair value of the securities issued of fair value of the financial liability extinguished, whichever is more clearly determinable, is recognized as gain or loss in profit or loss. So dito naman, instead na cash, ang ginamit niya naman is by issuing equity securities niya para magawa niya yung obligation niya. Next. Modification of terms. Borrower and lender may modify the terms of an existing financial liability. Modification results to substantially different terms. Modification is considered substantial if the present value of cash flows under the new terms, discounted the original effective interest rate, is at least 10% different from the carrying amount of the original financial liability. The original liability is recognized and replaced with a new one. So, ang sa modification of terms, parang pagbabago lang ng liability or pag-retire ng liability para ma-replace ng bago. Next. Trouble debt restructuring. The creditor grants the debtor who is undergoing financial difficulties concession that would not otherwise be granted in a normal business relationship. The restructuring usually involves easing or relaxing the terms of the debt in order to accommodate the debtor. Trouble debt restructuring is accounted for as modification of financial liability. So meron lang ditong special relationship between the party. Next. Waiver or cancellation by the creditor. If the creditor cancels a financial liability, the debtor recognize the liability and recognize a gain. So pag nag-cancel si creditor, makaka-recognize ng gain si debtor. Next.
For insubstance deficiency is an arrangement whereby a debtor purchases securities and places them in an irrevocable trust. The principal and interest on the securities are then used to pay off an existing debt as it matures. Does not release the debtor from its obligation on the existing debt which remains outstanding. In some cases, creditors are not even aware of the transaction and continue to look the debtor for repayment. In substance, deficiency is not accounted for as an extinguishment of a financial liability. So, offsetting a financial asset and a financial liability. A financial asset and a financial liability are offset and only the net amount is presented in the statement of financial position when the entity has both a legal right of set off and an intention to settle the amount on an on a net basis or simultaneously. Past 32 requires offsetting when doing so reflects the entity's expected future cash flows from settling two or more separate financial instruments. When both the legal right to net settlements and the intention to do so exist, the entity has in effect only a single financial asset or financial liability. Neither a legal right alone nor an intention alone warrants offsetting. A mere intention to settle net without the right to do so does not justify offsetting because the rights and obligation associated with the individual financial asset and financial liability remain unaltered. A legal right to settle net without the intention to do so also does not justify offsetting because this does not reflect the entity's expected future cash flows from settling two or more separate financial instruments. Offsetting is not appropriate for financial or other assets that are pledged as collateral for non-recourse financial liabilities and sinking fund and the related financial liability for which the fund was established. So again, I'm Mark Christopher Magbanwa.
And I am Kylie Kamantige.
So thank you, future accountant. God bless us all.